Okay, it's now 12 o'clock, so I think we'll kick off. I'll just like to open this meeting with a short karakia. Ko tēnei te wā ki te whakatū whera I te hui nei, kia I noi tātou. Mauri oho, mauri tū, mauri ora kia tātou. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Kia ora te whānau, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei hui, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. Ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, ko Otaki te haukainga, kei te hiringa waka ahau e mahi ana, he menetia tāku tūranga mahi, ko Marisa tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome along everyone to this TEL SIG webinar. My name is Marisa King, and along with Natalie Smith, who's also online, we are the co-conveners of TEL SIG, and it's our very great pleasure to be hosting this webinar today and to be welcoming our speaker, Valerie Love. So Valerie is the Kaipupuri Pūranga Matihiko Matua, Senior Digital Archivist at the Alexander Turnbull Library, and she's responsible for the transfer, ingest and management of born digital unpublished heritage collections. Valerie is also a trained hatha and yin yoga teacher, and before moving to Aotearoa in 2011, they worked as Curator for Human Rights Collections at the Thomas J. Dodd Research Centre, University of Connecticut, and contributed to the volume Through the Archival Looking Glass, a reader on diversity and inclusion, published in 2014 by the Society of American Archivists Press. Valerie is going to talk to us today about stress in the library and archival work environment. This is always a timely topic, and I had the pleasure of watching a webinar that LIANZA, a similar webinar that Valerie gave for LIANZA some time ago, and I was very, very taken by what she had to say, and so I'm very pleased that we've been able to make the most of her knowledge and expertise for all of our TEL SIG members and possibly others. So just in terms of housekeeping, if you have any questions for Valerie, if you could please hold those until the end of her presentation. And also please feel free to go ahead and introduce yourselves to each other and chat if you would like to in the chat box. But basically the format will be the presentation followed by Q&A. So without any further delay, please welcome Valerie.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki tēnei hui, he kamahi ahau no te Puna Mātauranga o Aotearoa, he Kaipupuri Pūranga Matihiko Matua ahau, ko Valerie Love tōku ingoa, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So hi everyone, my name is Valerie Love, and I am the Senior Digital Archivist at the Alexander Turnbull Library here at the National Library of New Zealand in Wellington. And thanks so much to Marisa and Natalie for inviting me to give this talk today. And as Marisa said, this is actually an updated version of a webinar I gave for LIANZA in 2018, which to be honest feels like a lifetime ago now. So as my accent and mihi give away, I am a transplant to Aotearoa. I grew up in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, and I have a master's degree in library and information studies from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And my first taste of the GLAM life was as a library assistant at my university at Smith College. And one of the very first tasks that I was assigned was rehousing the papers of Sylvia Plath. And that was a dream to my slightly angsty, slightly depressive 20-year-old self. And it really hooked me on archival work. And I've been working in libraries and archives ever since. But in addition to my archival career, I'm also a trained yoga teacher and have been practicing yoga for the past 16 years and teaching it for the past 10. And in a lot of ways, my archival career and yoga and wellness activities have really been intermingled. I started practicing yoga at the ripe old age of 25 when I began having low back pain because I was moving lots of transit boxes and putting boxes on the top of shelves and not really doing it properly or taking care of myself very well. And so one of my friends suggested that I try yoga, and I have to admit, I didn't really like it very much at the time, but it did make my back start to feel better. So I kept going and uncovered lots of benefits from a steady yoga practice, both physically and mentally, and then I decided to study it more formally. So what I'm going to talk about today is self-care and ways of managing stress in the GLAM sector. And I wanted to talk about this for a few reasons, in part because no one is immune from stress. And I actually think that people underestimate the amount of stress that people that work in libraries and archives and museums and other GLAM sector institutions face. And I, for one, absolutely love this field and I love the work that I do, but there have also been times in previous roles where I've been pretty close to burnout and thought about walking away from the profession altogether. And in conversations that I've had with colleagues around the world, I know that I'm not alone in experiencing that. So over the years, I've gotten a lot smarter about how I work and I've gotten better about how I take care of myself in this field. And I think it's really important for us as a profession to have these conversations. So thank you so much to LIANZA and to all of you who are taking time out of your day to be here and participate. So I definitely want to begin by acknowledging the work of Beth Wishart and Kat Cuttress, who gave a presentation at the 2015 LIANZA conference here in Wellington about dealing with workplace stress in the libraries. And I also want to give a shout out to Liz Fosline and Molly West Duffy, who were the co-authors and illustrators of No Hard Feelings, The Secret Power of Embracing Emotion at Work. And the cartoon that was on the previous slide was one of their fabulous illustrations, and you'll see more of those sprinkled out through today's presentation. So today, I'm going to be talking about types of stress and impact on the mental and physical body, common stressors in the GLAM sector, which, to be honest, we probably all kind of have a sense of what those might be. But we're also going to talk about ways of managing stress as individuals and organizational ways of managing stress. And then I just have a few resources and support at the end. So before we begin properly, I have a couple of disclaimers. So my first disclaimer is that I'm an archivist and a yoga teacher. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a mental health professional. What I know, I've learned from studying yoga and yoga philosophy and teaching mindfulness and my just on-the-job experience. But what I know is just a very small piece of a much larger puzzle. And everyone is unique. And everyone's unique in terms of how they process and manifest stress. And there's no advice or experience that I can give that's going to work for everyone all the time. So if you have any concerns about your own well-being, then please do seek out professional advice. And then finally, it's been a year. It has been pretty wild. We are a year into a global pandemic like nothing that any of us have lived through before. And it hasn't been easy for anyone. So if you're feeling exhausted or unsettled or just kind of blah, that is totally justified and you're definitely not alone. Dr. Dougal Sutherland, a clinical psychologist at Victoria University in Wellington, describes COVID-19 fatigue as the mental and emotional load of needing to be alert and on guard in a way that most of us have never really had to do before. And so we're mentally on alert, and there's a greater sense of uncertainty and things being out of our control and plans disrupted. And Auckland has gone into lockdown 4 times now, and twice just in the past month. So that's not an easy thing. That's a lot. In addition to any stresses that might be, in your workspace or in your home lives. So just acknowledging that from the start. So what do we mean by stress? Most people are familiar with sort of the dictionary definition of stress as being a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or demanding circumstances. But the term stress was originally coined in 1936 by Hans Seely, a Hungarian-Canadian endocrinologist, who defined it as the non-specific response of the body to any demand for change. So for Seely, it didn't matter whether the stimulus was good or bad, just the fact that it was a change at all and required the body to respond differently than it normally would be considered stress. And there's a couple of different types of stress. So not all stress is actually a bad thing. There's good stress that motivates us and moves us forward and can spark creativity and insight. But then there's also bad stress, and that's the type of stress that begins to hinder everyday life and sometimes feels beyond our ability to cope. And while we often think of stress as being a mental feeling, stress is in fact a hardwired physical response. And in essence, stress arises when something we care about is at stake. And if we didn't care about it, we wouldn't feel stress. And I was actually laughing the other day because the rapper Ice-T posted this exact same statement, except his was sort of full of explicitive, like, so I didn't screenshot it and add it to this talk, but I was like, yeah, Ice-T knows it. And that's part of the reason why this past year has felt so hard, because the pandemic has really threatened all of the things that we care most about in our lives. You know, our health, our families, our friends, our jobs, our stability, our routines, and just our ability to plan anything going forward. It all feels like, or it all can feel like, that's been thrown up into the air. And that's a hugely stressful thing. So there's two main mindsets that people tend to have about stress. So the first is that stress is harmful and should be avoided, reduced, and managed. And the second mindset is that stress is helpful and should be accepted, utilized, and embraced. And I do want to clarify here that I don't mean pandemic stress, I don't mean trauma, I don't mean anything like that. I'm talking about just sort of regular day-to-day stress. And I'm talking, you know, and so this presentation is actually quite a good example of that. So I'm an introvert, and public speaking can definitely be a source of stress. But for me, that public speaking is a good source of stress because it challenges me and it helps me to build new skills and new connections and to grow. But that's also why when I was first asked to give this talk last year, I said no, because I was already in a state of heightened stress, and I knew that I needed to wait to do something else that was going to be stressful until I had the mental space and energy to really be able to devote to it and to do it in a way where I, you know, wasn't going to become overwhelmed. So acute stress is basically a physiological response to what the body or mind perceives as danger. And anthropologically, the body's stress response is the same today as it was for early humankind. And so stress is both a defense and an offense mechanism in the body. The amygdala is essentially the watchtower in the brain, and that senses a threat. And then the adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys, secrete stress hormones and chemicals such as adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol, among others. And that acts on the autonomic functions of the body and stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is what triggers that, it triggers the fight, flight, or freeze response, because it's actually sending metabolic changes to the energy supplies in cells to prepare the body to either fight or run. And when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, your heart rate increases and your blood pressure goes up, and the body sends glucose to the muscles and they get tense. And also your mental acuity and focus can increase. And this is really to save you from some sort of impending danger. And you may feel flushed or begin to sweat. And the sympathetic nervous system will also shut down the non-essential systems in the body in order to send more energy where it's needed so you can run from danger or fight if you need to. But alternately, it may send the body into freeze mode, essentially a shock state where the body protects itself by shutting down, which is a really common trauma response. So what this means is that when your body is going into an acute stress response, there will be less energy going to the functions that are managed by the parasympathetic nervous system. And this includes things like digestion, elimination, growth, repair, and reproductive functions. So once the danger has passed, the good news is that human beings are resilient and our bodies are, sorry about that. Human beings are resilient. Our bodies are designed to handle stress and process stress hormones and return to a state of homeostasis or internal balance. And the body naturally switches back and forth between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems to operate in balance. And this happens all the time without even, really having to think about it or realizing it. However, different people respond to stress differently depending upon their own life experiences and personal tendencies, as well as genetics, environment, social support structures, and a whole host of other factors. So the exact same situation may generate very different responses in one person to another. And one of the ways that the body processes stress hormones is through intense physical activity. So that might be fleeing from a predator, for example. But modern stressful situations, particularly stressful situations in the workplace, don't really allow you to jump up from your chair in your meeting and do a couple of laps around the block to release this energy that's now suddenly inside of you as a result of these feelings of stress. So we have to help the body process this activation in different ways. When cortisol levels are activated, the sympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system stays activated instead of switching back to that parasympathetic nervous system. And so the more stress you're under, the more cortisol the body produces, and it can take a while for that cortisol to be cleared from the body. So basically, with chronic stress, the body is staying in that activated state. And when the sympathetic nervous system stays activated, it can make you feel really agitated and maybe angry, maybe anxious, maybe hypervigilant. And all of these reactions use a lot of energy, both physically and mentally. So in the long term, you can wind up feeling quite depleted, where you just can't manage that, you can't maintain that level of stimulation on a longer term basis. And so that anxiety might end up shifting towards depression, or you might end up with decreased immunity or exhaustion, or sometimes physical pain, or other issues. And this is something that I'm speaking firsthand here. I mean, I've definitely experienced this myself. And as a yoga teacher, I've seen it in my students as the reason why they start coming to classes. So moving from stress into overwhelm, depression, and anxiety can also be a sign of disconnection. And this can be harder to maintain when more of us are working remotely. We definitely need connection, even just talking something through with someone. And you may not be able to do anything for the person, they might not be able to do anything for you, but when you feel like you're alone in your stress, it becomes all the more upsetting. And so one of the things that's really helped me in stressful situations is just knowing that I've got somebody at work who's going to have my back, or that trusted person that I can go and talk to and get a different perspective on a situation. And that's really inspired my own management style and the way that I try to interact with my colleagues. So I'm going to now talk a little bit about general stressors as well as workplace specific stressors. So physical stressors, and I've been sitting long enough and the lights have just turned off in here, so I'm gonna wave around. Physical stressors are things that make it harder for your body to perform basic functions. And this can be really simple. It can be something like being dehydrated, not getting enough sleep, or being in physical pain. Sometimes if you have an allergy or there's a food that's causing inflammation in the body, that could be a problem too. And again, that's really different for everybody. I mean, if gluten's not a problem for you, then gluten's not a problem. But if you are celiac or sensitive to it, then it's going to cause inflammation and lots of problems, and then that will manifest as stress in the physical body. And then there's also things like psychological stressors, in addition to all of the physical things that could be going on. And psychological stressors are things like financial worries, and that really is a big one. Work pressure, relationship issues, psychological impact of chronic illness, or having to deal with difficult people on a regular basis. That can all be a really, something that causes a lot of psychological stress, or if you're experiencing bullying or other environments where it's just not really nice to be. And these are things that all of us will experience at some point in our lives. There's always going to be some sort of unstable thing. There's always stuff that happens in life. And as long as the body is processing stress hormones and getting back to that state of homeostasis, then that's okay. But it's where the body gets stuck in that cycle of stress without resolution and gets stuck into the chain of producing more and more cortisol, then that's where those issues can begin to arise. So common stressors in the GLAM sector, these are the types of things that you might encounter on the job. There's probably other things I haven't even thought of, but there's a lot of them on this slide. We are in the business of providing access to information and knowledge and preserving culture and history and documenting contemporary life. And there's never enough resources to actually do that. At virtually every institution, you're always having to make difficult decisions about what to collect, how to cope with less funding, what to prioritize, how to manage with less staffing. But at the same time, user expectations and needs are higher than ever. And libraries and museums in Christchurch in particular have done so much to support the community in the years since the Canterbury earthquakes and the mosque shootings, and that can take a massive toll on staff as well. And I also want to acknowledge potential inequity in workloads for GLAM staff from underrepresented groups. Obviously, inclusion and equality is something that we all need to be working towards continually. But we need to also make sure that we're not putting extra pressure on Māori staff in particular, who might be asked over and over to be on different committees or to, do this sort of extra mahi in addition to what's actually in their job descriptions. And a lot of times this can be a labor of love, but it also needs to be really formally recognized by organizations to make sure that staff are supported and that they don't feel additional stress or pressure by these obligations. So the next slide is something that I actually experienced just this week. It's Pride, the Pride Festival here in Wellington, and the library has a number of talks and events, including a lunchtime talk that I gave yesterday about queer collections in the Turnbull Library collections. And unfortunately, the trolls came out on Facebook. So, people were writing comments, and here there's somebody that was actually, saying that they called the Human Rights Commission to, complain about this inappropriate treatment, and that the Human Rights Commission then, wanted them to prosecute the National Library, which is one of those things which, rationally, you can know that, okay, this is a troll comment. They haven't actually called the Human Rights Commission, and even if they did, that's fine. You deal with it, like if that happens, then that happens, and you move forward and you address the concerns. But in this case, it was somebody just being, just making online comments because they could hide behind a screen and make online comments. And I can rationally know that. But at the same time, as somebody who was giving this talk and, who identifies as queer, this, I could feel my chest tightening when I saw these comments on our Facebook page, and I felt a tangible physical response to this. So that's where I really needed to remind myself, okay, let's stop, let's take a deep breath, and remember that while this stuff might feel very personal, this person doesn't know me, and they don't know the collections, and they don't know the library. And these comments are a reflection on them much more so than they are on anyone else. But this can still be really hard, especially if you're planning an event or an exhibition, and then the public response is quite different than what you were expecting. So, signs of stress within an organization. This is ways in which you can begin to, if you take a step back and see, is my organization a healthy place to work? These are the things where if you begin to see these things, you might want to do a little bit more thinking about how you can turn these around a little bit. So absenteeism is higher than usual number of absences. And this can happen too when people are just stressed out and they don't want to come to work. Now, presenteeism is the opposite, where somebody continues to come into work when they really shouldn't be. Like they actually should be staying home because they're sick or taking a break or taking their annual leave, but they just feel like there's too much going on. They can't possibly miss a day, that sort of thing. And then that can put other staff and clients at risk of, carrying that stress as well, or just sort of, ending up taking on some of that mentally burnt out feelings. And this is something that I've seen actually get in some ways better as a result of the way we work in a COVID-19 world, where it's now more acceptable to stay home if you're sick, and people are actually really encouraging that. But I've definitely been in workspaces where somebody has had a cold and they don't think they can get cover, and they come in and it's kind of gross and unpleasant for everyone. So it's good that workplaces are now more flexible and there's more acceptance of flexible working. But then, high staff turnover, if people are gossiping, if there's, disengagement among staff, if if there's this culture of negativity and pessimism, that can have a negative impact even on your staff members that are, really enjoying their work and in a good space. So it's just really being aware of the energy in your organization, and making sure that the spark that draws so many of us to the cultural heritage sector is in an environment, that the environment is lighting that spark and it's not snuffing it out. So this is another one of the Liz and Molly images, which I absolutely love. And one of the reasons why I just love this so much is because A, it's true, as many of their things are, but people think that hard work is what actually makes us productive. And it's actually having balance. It's doing the work, but it's also taking care of ourselves. It's having time off, taking a break, and just making sure that you have balance in your life. And actually, the other thing that I was going to say about that too is that there's actually been a bit of research into the fact that people are taking fewer breaks in sort of like a COVID working environment situation, because they're not going on vacations. They're, if you've already been staying in your house for, weeks on end, maybe the last thing you kind of want to do is take a day off and then just stay in your house more. So there's higher levels of burnout in places around the world that have had longer lockdowns than we have. And also, if you're trying to balance, working from home with parenting, that's a whole other level of stress, and it can be really hard to feel like you get any sort of downtime. So one of the things that I found really useful is the writings of Dr. Sarb Johal. He has a new book out. It's called Steady, that basically is a whole bunch of tips for thriving in a COVID-19 world. And then he also has blogs and YouTube videos. And so he's come up with a set of tips that are really good for some of the lockdown and alert level changes that we've been experiencing here in Aotearoa. So his first tip is just reducing the overwhelm. It's not that lockdown ever gets easier, but we have done this before. So if we needed to, you think about what worked for you last time and see what you can bring into it again. He also recommends making a public promise or having an accountability buddy. So that way, if you tell somebody, what you're planning to do, then you're more likely to actually do it. And then his final advice is just to expect that things aren't always going to go the way you plan, and that things may be difficult. And so it's really useful to have some go-to strategies or go-to phrases that you can draw on when you're feeling quite pressured in a situation. And I'm sorry, my hay fever is acting up a little bit. So where to begin? The first place is always just when you begin to feel those feelings of overwhelm or those feelings of stress, to just pause and see if you can take a deep breath. And I know it's super cliche, and it doesn't always feel like, sometimes it feels like that's the last thing you want to do when you're really riled up, but it does actually help. The other thing that really helps is getting away from the desk, just taking a step back, saying, what, this email came in, I find it really stressful, and I'm just going to take a break and take a moment to think about it before I respond. And so get up from the desk, go get yourself a cup of tea. And the other thing that can help too is, especially like in the evening, if you're feeling really wired because you've had a big day, just putting your legs up against the wall and just sort of elevating your feet can actually help relax the nervous system, because what it's doing is it's bringing the blood flow downward to the vital organs of the body. So it's just taking, the body's working really hard to pump blood and to, bring the blood upward to the heart and the brain and the lungs and the vital organs. And if you're lying down and your feet are elevated, then gravity is doing that work for you. So it just helps the body to just physically relax a little bit. And even if you just do this for 5 minutes a day, it can, in the evening before you go to bed, it can make falling asleep a little bit easier. Again, this is just some things that you might try, but there's no magic bullet. There's nothing that works for absolutely everyone all the time. And then the other thing too is just witnessing the moment. So if you can feel yourself getting stressed, just checking in with yourself. How are you feeling right now? And if you're not okay in that moment, that's okay. Like, that happens. There's, it's impossible to be okay all the time. So be kind to yourself. If you're feeling stressed, if you're feeling upset about something, yeah, don't beat yourself up for that. We all have emotions. We bring our whole selves to work, and sometimes you can't bury that down. And likewise, if your colleagues are having a tough day, that's okay. We all have tough days. And so it's just, acknowledging that that's okay too. And sometimes, somebody else's response to you has nothing to do with you because they're going through something and you don't actually know that. And then the other thing that's useful is to, in those moments, look for something that you can be grateful for, no matter how small. And again, that feels really cliche, but it can be really, really helpful to say, oh, all of these things went wrong, but this one thing went right. And then just to remind yourself that it's not everything. It's a lot of things, but there's also some things that are okay. And so that just sort of helps you to put things into perspective. And especially in a work environment, you're going to have potentially lots of competing demands. There's lots of people that think their project or their work is the most important thing right now, and that should be your focus. And you can't do it all. So you do have to establish boundaries, be clear about what your priorities are, make sure that your team knows what the priorities are and that everyone is working towards them. And then the other thing too is just, it can be really easy to make work sort of this all-consuming thing because there's a big project to deliver or an exhibition coming up or whatever. And so you can put a lot of energy into work, but you still have to make sure that there's balance in your life. So don't let work, like I have definitely had times where I've been working on major projects and then at 3 a.m. I wake up and I have this idea and I'm like, oh, and then I start like typing or, or I'll, write down notes at 3 in the morning and I'm just like, no, like you can do that, not at 3 in the morning. And it's, it's sometimes hard to break out of that habit. And then finally, I've said it before, but I'll keep saying it, take regular breaks because stepping away from the computer can sometimes spark the greatest insights. If you can get up, walk around the building, walk around the block, it really can help when you're feeling quite stuck on a tricky issue. This is one of my absolute favorite quotes. This is something that helped get me through a big data migration project where it felt like a lot of things were at stake and it all had to be done, really precisely and in a really short time frame. And I would be sitting at my desk and did I take a break for morning tea? Did I stop for lunch? Did I realize that actually I'd had to go to the bathroom for the past hour and I was just plugging away on the computer and not actually paying any attention to my physical needs? So I love this quote because it just reminds you that, to get back to some of those really basic physical needs, have a cup of tea, have a biscuit, and don't beat yourself up if you are feeling quite stressed or feeling like you're overwhelmed. And again, we've sort of talked about this before, but in terms of managing your own stress, observe how you're feeling without judgment. Don't beat yourself up for being human. Pause and take a deep breath, step away from the computer, ask for help when you need it. And the other thing too is don't assume the worst. So there's lots of things that we worry about in the GLAM sector. There's lots of things that we should, be really mindful of and be really, really thinking about the consequences. But you can also spend a lot of time preparing for the worst, and that worst might not actually happen. And then you've just created a lot of stress and a lot of angst for, that you didn't actually need to be spending your energy on. So thinking about what you want the outcomes to be and giving yourself permission to be optimistic and to be hopeful that that will actually happen instead of just saying, oh, this project is going to fail, this is never going to work. And then allowing yourself time to recover. So making sure that if you've had a really big week, that you get some downtime on the weekend, taking a day off if you need it, Just making sure that you're not constantly pushing yourself, because we're capable of working really hard. We're capable of doing amazing things, but you still need recovery time. And then in the longer term, establishing boundaries, making sure that you know when to say no to things if they're not actually a priority, being mindful of how you're spending your energy, being mindful of the energy of people around you, making sure that you're not bringing bad energy into a space or absorbing somebody else's bad energy, and just doing the things that are going to make you happy. And I know that, again, sounds really cliche, but you know, sometimes a yoga class is really helpful, and sometimes yoga is the last thing I need. Sometimes what I really need is to sit in my car, blast some music, and sing really loudly to like a cheesy 80s song, and that makes me feel better. So it's really finding the things that are going to get your energy back to a place, you know, that place of homeostasis, that place where you feel, you know, where you feel in control and, you know, and ready for the next thing. So within your organization, again, you know, this is really important for those of you that manage teams, but, you know, a workplace culture really starts from the top down. So if you're modeling good behaviors, if you're developing and fostering a culture of whanaungatanga and manakitanga, and making sure that your team and your colleagues feel supported, that's going to go a long way in terms of reducing stress levels among staff. Supporting your colleagues, and small gestures can mean a lot. And sometimes this is just checking in with somebody. Sometimes it's saying, hey, do you want to go get a cup of tea? And, you know, we're leaving a note card on somebody's desk, or sending a thank you note or an email if, you know, if somebody has done something that's, you know, been really helpful or, you know, or meaningful. And again, just being realistic with what you can actually achieve. You can't constantly do more with less. So making sure that, again, you're prioritizing what's important. And yeah, you can start team meetings with a simple mindfulness breathing exercise or a karakia to help just sort of settle the space and bring people into the moment, instead of having them continue to carry whatever came before, whatever meeting they were just in. And trusting your staff and listening to them. If somebody tells you there's a problem, don't just ignore that. Make sure that you work with them to address that problem, and make sure that your staff are feeling supported. And this is another one of those illustrations that I think really resonates sometimes. In an ideal world, if we had all the things that we needed to, you know, to be in balance, then we would have a lot less stress in our lives. You know, there would be less issues of disconnection and, you know, and depression and things like that. But the reality is that we often, you know, it's often really, really hard to make time for all the things that we need for that sort of ideal, you know, ideal wellness. So again, just being mindful of that, and, you know, making sure that you're spending your time in ways that are actually going to be helpful. And I feel like I've already said all of these things. Take a break. Self-care does not have to be time-consuming or expensive. It can be going to bed 15 minutes earlier. Again, it can be like dancing badly in the living room. It can be just whatever it is that you need in the moment to feel more like yourself. Finally, you don't have to go through any of this alone. And it is a million times harder to get out of a cycle of depression or anxiety if you are trying to face that on your own. So ask support when you need it, you know, talk to your doctor, like do the things that you need to do to take care of yourself, because there is no shame in that whatsoever. And then just remembering that things are tough, but we are able to get through tough things, and you've got this. And that is pretty much all I had to say. So thank you all so much for taking time to join me today. I hope this has been helpful. I'm going to wave and get the lights to come back on. And I think we have some time for some questions.
We do, absolutely. Thank you so much, Valerie. I've been scribbling away notes all the way through your presentation, and I think you really set the tone at the start when you said that people do underestimate the stress we face in this sector. A lot of people, when they find out that I work in a library, they say, oh, that must be a really nice job. And yeah, sometimes it is, and sometimes it's really, really hard. I really liked your practical tips about, you know, just remembering to go outside during the day, putting your legs against the wall at the end of the day. That's something that I'm going to be doing. And also as a manager, the importance of modeling good behaviors and making sure that I'm showing my team that I'm managing my own stress well. So thank you.